holding vital technology, and facilitating the deaths of millions for the sake of their own greed. And these are views that are gaining more steam every day, but if you ask me, they're not moving fast enough. And if you know skeptics in your own life or family who may be resistant or slow to arrive at some of these conclusions, maybe hearing these things from someone with a background like today's guest will be something to move their needle a little further into the fringe with the rest of us. And sometimes someone with a more official mouthpiece is what's needed. His name is Paul Hellyer, and he was Canada's youngest member of parliament when he was first elected in 1949, and 8 years later became the youngest cabinet minister appointed as Minister of Defense. He's also authored a dozen books. His newest one is called The Money Mafia, and most importantly, on a planet of 7 billion people, he was the first person of cabinet rank in a G8 nation to go on the record stating that extraterrestrials and UFOs are very real. You gotta give a man props for that. I'm very happy to have him here. 91 years young. Paul, my man, welcome to THC.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it is a serious honor for me, Paul. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. The ET situation and the New World Order are probably the two biggest conspiracies out there, and it's very refreshing to hear someone who's been involved in government at such a high level come to these same conclusions. And to get us started here, I kind of gave the cliff notes to your story, but you've had an interesting life and several accomplishments that I glossed over in the intro. Would you mind giving the people a little more education on your background and story?
Well, I spent most of my life in and out of politics. And the reason I actually went in the first place was because I'm a child of the Depression, the Great Depression. And I saw poverty at its rawest level. And so after spending a couple of years in the armed forces, I went to university and studied economics. And I asked my professors if recessions and depressions were essential. And they couldn't give me an honest answer. What they said, in effect, is, well, we always have them, and therefore they're part of the system. But they couldn't tell me why they were part of the system because they didn't make any sense to me. So finally, I figured out they were not, in fact, essential, and that they were really a result from the banking system that had been in place for a long time, and that the whole situation was subject to solution if you change the system. So in 1949, legitimate, or they would call themselves economists, the regular economists were saying that there was going to be a depression, an underlying D, in 1950. And I said to myself, well, this isn't necessary, so, and I know what has to be done about it, so I'm going to have to run for parliament and see if I can do something. So I graduated from university in May and was elected to the House of Commons in June. And then, of course, you learn the first lesson that just because you have your picture in the front page of the second section of the Toronto Star, the big circulation newspaper in Canada, doesn't mean that you have any influence when you get to Ottawa. You're just another MP. But, and this is the interesting thing, the Depression didn't happen because of the Korean War. The Korean War came along, and always people running the world and pulling the strings will start manufacturing money in order to win a war when they won't manufacture the same amount of money to win the peace.
Right.
It's a loaded system and always has been for, hundreds of years. And so, of course, with the money that was injected into the system as a result of the Korean War, we had about 15 or 20 years of what I call the golden years. But the problem hasn't gone away because we had a really good system here in Canada from 1939 to 1974, where the money creation function was shared between the Government of Canada and the private banks. But in 1974, the Bank of Canada unilaterally changed this and call it conspiracy, call it what you like. It's a fact that they started taking their orders from the Bank of International Settlements in Zurich, Switzerland. And one of the things that they were told to do by the BIS, as we call it, was to stop providing governments with zero-cost money, with low-cost money. So the Bank of Canada went along with that. It's been downhill for Canada ever since. And we've accumulated enough debt that during the period from when they changed the system in 1974-75 to 2010-11, we Canadians paid $1,100,000,000,000 interest on accumulated debt from those recessions of 81, 82, and 1991 that the central banks of the world brought on. And none of this was necessary. And if you multiply that by 12 or 13 for the American situation, you get an idea of the kind of money that we're really talking about. Of the issues in the world, the most urgent is solving this monetary crisis, because we have a situation where a handful of people who are at the apex of what I call the cabal have a monopoly on creating money. And consequently, they have the power to make or break countries and to make or break politicians. And it's just far, far too much power. But the most important thing is that they use this monopoly to create not money but credit, which has to be repaid with interest. And consequently, the whole system now is run on debt. And it's debt which has to be repaid with interest. And there's no way that can be done because nobody creates any money to pay the interest. So you have a hopeless situation. And we're now in our, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, about seventh year of recession, and no way of getting out of it except through government-created money. And it's so simple that a 12-year-old, could figure it out. But here we have the greatest brains of the world ignoring the problem and saying, well, the young people of today can't have it as good as their parents or grandparents. And just this high unemployment is a natural cyclical thing, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, that is all, BS.
Right.
It is just propaganda made to get people to accept a bad situation and not do anything about it. So this is the reason the book is called The Money Mafia, and the reason I use that word. We're having an investigation in Montreal about the alleged take of the Sicilian mafia there of about 2.5% off the top of all the city contracts. And it's still ongoing. Well, the banking system outdoes them so much it makes them look like pikers. The banking system takes 95% off the top. 95% off the top, literally. And so they can invest $5 million in their bank. They can then leverage it, as they call it, leverage it up by 20 times, and they can make $100 million in loans based on that $5 million. And the loans can be made to governments or business or private individuals or for mortgages or whatever. And all of that money, the $100 million, has to be repaid in what I call blood, sweat, and tears money with interest.
Right. That's one of the real scams is where does the interest come from? The individuals can't print money, only the banks can. So
nobody prints the money for the interest. So what they have to do is keep inflating the system, printing more money, putting people further into debt in order to pay the interest on the debt that they already owe. And it's a hopeless situation. It has to be changed. And of course, that's one of the principal theses of the book, is that we have to do that or we're going to be damned with this situation we have in Europe today, where Europe is, the 25% unemployment rates and uprisings, real or potential in Greece and two or three other southern countries, I guess Spain and maybe Italy. And nobody's doing anything about it. They're just sitting there saying, well, maybe it will all work out in the end. Well, the answer is it won't all work out in the end because it's a hopeless situation and it's got to be changed. We have this organization called the G20, which was put together a few years ago to sort of regulate the world and make us all march to the same drummer. And they spent the first 3 or 4 years trying to patch up this lousy banking system. And of course, they didn't patch it up. They made it safer for the banks, but it didn't do anything for the people. On the contrary, we're worse off now in many ways than we were then. The governments are greater debt. The U.S. Government has to keep, the Congress has to keep increasing its debt limit. Individual debt in Canada is at an all-time high, and so on. And so the system is nothing but one great big Ponzi scheme, and we have to start out by solving that one. And the solution is very easy, very simple, and I've got it all spelled out, and not for the first time, but again in the Money Mafia. And I just hope that a lot of people will read it and then take the kind of action we can talk about later to reverse the course of history and get the president to start doing the things that have to be done, and that would include getting rid of the Fed. There will be no peace on earth and justice on earth as long as the Fed exists, because it's owned by bankers, not by the people, notwithstanding the high-sounding title it's got. And they're going to have to set up a publicly owned Bank of the United States. In the meantime, you have this anomaly that the president can mint platinum coins, I think it is. You could start out with a couple of $1 trillion platinum coins and share them with the states and to get the economy up and rolling and stop the austerity and start offering some hope to young people and paying decent wages to the large number of people who are working at substandard wages and who can't really make ends meet. So that's sort of the end of my little sermon. It's not really the end, it's just the beginning, but it'll do for the moment.
Yeah, that is a really good introduction, and it is so interesting because here in America, almost everyone, all we know is the Federal Reserve. So, and the idea of switching that, it seems like so tough to do, but yet to hear that in 1974 you actually had a public bank in Canada, that's very awesome, and it's inspiring to hear because it lets us know that, you know, the tide can be turned. Can you elaborate at all for people who might be so foreign to this, how it might have affected the life of the average Canadian as opposed to obviously the debt-based banking system they use now?
Oh, absolutely. In 1938 in Canada, and I remember it well, when there were no jobs, period. No jobs. 1939, the war comes along, and first thing you know, everybody is either in the armed forces or working. And we reduced unemployment from the high of the Depression down to an historic low of 1%. And I'm not recommending that low now because that would probably be inflationary and it's not necessary. And you have people changing jobs and so on. But I would say half what unemployment rates are worldwide, and more than that in Europe and so on, where they have 25% unemployment rates. But we achieved this great low, and you might say, well, where did the Canadian government get the money to do this? And the answer is the Bank of Canada printed it, Printed. And the government would hand the Bank of Canada a bond, and the Bank of Canada would print the value of the bond, put the money in the government's bank account, and that was then spent into circulation to pay the members of the armed forces. I will remember when I was first inducted, being paid in cash, lining up for the sergeant major to roll off a few dollar bills that we got at the end of the week. And there was much more of a cash economy at that time than there is now. Well, that money that was spent by the government to pay the soldiers and to build factories, to manufacture munitions, and to do all the things that were necessary. And in the course of the war, Canada became a principal player. We had, I think it was the fourth largest Navy in the world, whereas before we had nothing. And we had the Commonwealth Air Training Plan here. We were training pilots for Britain and other Commonwealth countries and for Norway, and making a tremendous contribution. And the money went into the private banks that the government spent for this, where it became what economists called high-powered money. Well, then the private banks used that high-powered money to leverage it up, and at that time they were allowed to lend 12.5 times their cash reserves, and so they could help finance building factories and so on. And we had a system where this, obviously, money creation was shared between the government of Canada and the private banks. And that got us out of the Depression, helped finance the war, and then after the war, helped finance the great post-war times and the infrastructure, including the Trans-Canada Highway, the great St. Lawrence Seaway, which we share with the United States, and the new terminal buildings at our airports, and also to help pay for the foundation of our Social Security system, which was considered one of the best in the world. When all of a sudden, the money mafia somehow gets through to the governor of the Bank of Canada and got him to adopt what they called monetarism. That's the ideas of Milton Friedman and his colleagues at the University of Chicago, and start treating inflation by monetary means alone, which was a dreadful mistake and was responsible for a lot of the debt that has been accumulated in the world since. And then to stop creating any money, low cost, zero cost money for governments, which they had been doing during the war. As I said, it's been downhill ever since, and the United States has accumulated this huge debt, which was all money created out of thin air. I mean, this myth of what money is something that people don't understand. They don't understand that there's no real money there. It's just bank accounts. And these bank accounts were created by the private banks. And we call it money because we allow people to pay their debts with bank checks rather than insisting on having cash, which of course is far more cumbersome, and we wouldn't want to go back to that. But it worked so well that in 1974-75, we had practically no debt in Canada. And it was only when they changed the system and in effect adopted the one that you have that we started going deeply into debt and resulted in having to pay all of this interest, and we're still paying it. And too much of our tax money is being siphoned off for that, which is the reason that we don't have enough to fix water mains that are 100 years old and need to be replaced, and replace bridges and build new rapid transit systems, which are just desperately needed in a city like Toronto, which is where I live. And all of these things waiting to be done, and there's no money for it unless you borrow it, which in the old days we didn't have to do. At least we didn't have to pay interest on it. But now we have to pay interest simply because a few of the top bankers of the world are pulling the strings and setting the rules. And the G20 has gone along and sort of said, yes, you guys know what you're doing. At least that's the implication. And we'll follow your rules and let you lend 20 times your capital, which is a ripoff of the worst possible order. It's grand larceny. I mean, there's an old saying: if you have a gun, you can rob a bank. If you have a bank, you can rob all the people.
Yeah, I like that. And it can be quite the revelation for someone when they first learn about the major scams of fractional reserve banking and how many of our problems would start to self-correct if we would just stop honoring the agreements with these bankers that a lot of times they've slid in under the radar to begin with. But, you also reference the cabal as the string pullers running the show. Of course, the banking cartels are a part of that, but what other sectors and groups do you consider powerful enough to be lumped in to make up the cabal as you see it?
Yes, it's sort of an amorphous group.
It is.
And it's a bit hard to define because it's been changing over the years. But the way I see it, the international banking cartel is at the top. They're the apex. They manufacture the money, and so as a result, they have the most control. Next to them would be the oil cartel. And they're the ones that keep us burning oil in our cars and planes and ships and so on, when we should be using exotic energies that have been developed but are kept secret deliberately by the cabal because they don't care about the future of the world. They just care about making money from cashing in their oil chips. And then the next thing on the rung would be the CEOs of the big multinational corporations around the world. And they have so much power now, it's just incredible. And these new trade agreements, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which incidentally is misnamed. It's not a partnership; it's a power grab. And in Canada, the Canada-European trade agreement that's proposed and been signed and just waiting to be ratified is, in effect, in my opinion, a power grab, which is high treason because it involves the banking system. And under those treaties, there is what they call a settlement mechanism, where if any country changes the rules, which affect the potential profitability, the real or potential profitability of foreign investors, they can be sued. So what we're proposing to do is to set up a system where if we were to go back to the kind of system I just described that worked perfectly for Canada from 39 to 74, if we were to do that again, which is the only thing that makes sense, slight variation on the theme, but the principle is exactly the same. If we signed the treaty and ratified it and then tried to do that, European banks could sue us for hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars.
Oh, wow.
Which means that it'll never be done, that we'd just be caught in this quicksand and never be able to get out of it.
Oh, man.
So this is how important these treaties are. And this Trans-Pacific Partnership has been negotiated in absolute secrecy, that people have no idea what's going on. And some of the ramifications are really, well, I was going to say deadly, and I guess that's a good word for it. Certainly it's the death of democracy.
Yeah.
Because the people lose all their power. It's transferred to the transnational corporations. And also some of the things that they would be required to make available, some of Monsanto's magic formulas for ending any choice whatsoever in foods and using seeds that aren't manufactured in general and genetically modified by them. All of these things being forced down the throats of countries all over the world under the guise of trade agreements. And it's just a terrible, terrible tragedy. And so if the president could do one additional thing in the next few months of his term before he comes to the end of it, it would be to kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership before it gets off the ground. He has fast track now. What I'm suggesting is that it be fast tracked into oblivion and get rid of it and restore a little democracy to the world system.
Yeah, that would be a great idea. It would help so many people. But do you think Obama means well, or do you think that he wouldn't be in the position that he was in if he wasn't already shaking hands and making deals with this cabal?
Well, I think it's a very subtle thing. I think he started out by thinking he was going to be a reformer, and that was before he found out the power of the cabal to really run things. And he's become a victim of it. Actually, just before he was sworn in as president, as a matter of fact, I saw a picture of his economic advisors, and they were the same old gang who had been there when the Bush recession came along.
Right.
And so they just revolving doors between the banks and the Treasury Department and the two political parties and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They just go round and round. This it's all part of the cabal, and it's all part of the monetary cartel. And these guys, it didn't matter to them very much who won, because they just go from party to party and get their big salaries and comfy pensions, regardless of who's on base. Now, what I'm really suggesting is that somehow, if President Obama, love him or hate him, could be persuaded that he could make a name for himself, a real legacy for himself, by, in concert with a few people from each party, a few good people from each party, of reversing nearly all of the policies adopted in the last 50 years. Now, that's a big, big deal.
Yeah.
But it has to start, because if it's ever going to finish, it has to be started. There's got to be a first move. And so what I'm really proposing in the book is a list of things that have to be done, and saying the time has come when We have to get at it. And now, because we're playing with fire. And, I didn't even finish with the cabal. I got down as far as the multinational corporations. Well, then the next level, tremendously important, are the intelligence agencies.
Right.
Mostly United States, but with a little cooperation from a couple of others in other parts of the world. But the CIA is involved, and the FBI. The CIA is sort of kingpin major domo and starting wars for the benefit of the military-industrial complex. And then the FBI is into its ears, I guess, now, and the NSA keeping track of everybody in the world. So when the New World Order is established, they'll know who's on first and who isn't. They can just divide the people who are their friends from the others and proceed. Then the final analysis, the final thing, of course, is a huge slice of the U.S. military, and this is the cabal. It's a huge, very powerful organization, and the sort of the only hope is numbers. And I point out to my friends, the banking cartel has the money, but the people have the numbers if they would just get together and use them in a nonpartisan way to say enough is enough already. And we want the system reversed because we don't want a third world war, which is the direction which we're headed at the present time, which could result in the end of the human species, actually, with the kinds of weapons that exist at the present time. We want the opposite. We want a world where there's justice and where every child, every color and religion has enough food to eat and clean water to drink and a shirt on his or her back, a little basic education, a little basic health care, so that they can determine their potential and how they can contribute to a better world.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of world we want. It's one of peace and cooperation, not the same old business of who can build a bigger empire and who's going to take control of us and tell us what to do and treat us as slave labor to make things comfy for them.
Yeah, it seems so simple. Everybody wants the same thing, but nobody seems to be able to get it because of this cabal. And I also mentioned in the introduction for you that you were the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 nation to go on record stating that extraterrestrials and UFOs are very real, and that is super refreshing. I got to thank you for that. And we're talking about the New World Order, but the extraterrestrial presence is another facet of this, and it's, some people might think it's a completely separate topic, but there's quite a bit of overlap, wouldn't you say, between the extraterrestrial cover-up and what the New World Order is doing?
Very much so, yes, very much so. And as you know, I was one of the people who spoke at the Citizens Disclosure hearing in Washington, May 2013. And the level of naivety is just incredible. And this, how the cabal could manage to keep the secret of what's going on to the extent that they have for so long is just absolutely amazing. The real problem is that we don't have a free press. We have a controlled press.
Right.
And consequently, because if there was a free press, some of these things would be out in the open in a matter of weeks or months. All they need is a couple of good investigative reporters to find out, not the whole scene, of course, but enough of it to raise the public ire and demand for disclosure of what has gone on in the last 68 years and what is still going on and what is planned. What's next on the schedule? So the interlocking is very difficult to talk about when they keep the whole thing secret.
Right.
But let's go back a little bit. The Germans in the 1930s were working with a species of extraterrestrials. And it's just, I guess, our good fortune that they didn't get the technology totally developed that was under discussion and development at the time before we did. But they were experimenting with flying saucers and other things. And so after the war, the United States military brought quite a few hundreds of Nazi scientists to the United States under what they called Operation Paperclip. And this is, you can Google this and find out about it. So it's this much is not secret, except nobody talks about it. Harry Truman said that they couldn't bring anybody who had had Nazi ties in any way, that had a Nazi background. But knowing the military, they didn't pay any attention to the commander-in-chief, and so they did it anyway. And they had some pretty high-ranking Nazis brought into the country, and they changed their names naturally, and they changed their documents, gave them false identities, and so they could then put them into important positions in the civil and military governments of the United States, sides of the United States. And they were working with this one species, and it seems that the relationship either continued throughout or was reestablished after the crashes at Roswell in 1947, and that they have been working with one or more species ever since, including the one that the Germans have been working with during the 1930s. And allegedly, there were agreements made. There were, whether you would call them contracts or treaties or just what you would call them, but agreements made as to what these foreign entities could do in exchange for technology. And these are the kinds of things that should be made available to the public. The public should be let in on the secret, were the agreements kept or were they broken, what were in them, and what were the conditions of the agreements, and to what extent, of course, was the technology transferred, because it appears to anyone that's even remotely aware of what's going on that there's been fantastic progress, just mind-blowing progress in 68 years from, the, wouldn't say backward, but the kind of society and the technology that we knew, I knew as a youngster in the 30s and 40s, and then what I believe to be true now, which is just light years different, really. And I mean light years as far as technological progress is concerned, because the aliens, as we call them, I think the official designation of the U.S. government was EBs, extraterrestrial biological entities, were, as they admitted, light years ahead as far as technology is concerned. And we have adopted quite a bit of this into our daily living. But it's the military side, I think, that, it would be interesting to know all of the things that were partially developed and developed more as a result of their technology, or the new things. And there were quite a few. Colonel Philip Corso, in his book, has a list there of things that he was involved in that, are really very interesting and play an important part in our lives today. I have a little lead pen light, for example, that I carry around in my pocket. Most useful. I can add up the bills when I'm out for dinner, make sure that I don't get cheated or cheat, either way. And my late wife used to complain until I found that I had been undercharged by a bottle of wine one night, which I insisted on paying for, and then she thought it was all right after that. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of things that were introduced into our society as a result of this technology, and that is one of the principal reasons, I would say, that we have made such absolutely incredible progress right across the board, both what we know and what we don't know in the last 5 or 6 decades. But I guess coming back to the subject, where do the relations stand at the present time? Who is the cabal working with? And is the cabal engaged in any way in undertaking projects on behalf of one or more of the species? And if so, what is the aim of the game? These are the things that we have to know, and we have to know right away.
Right. I'm kind of curious, we hear about multiple different races of ET. We hear about multiple factions, and the one we hear about the most is, and I guess it's just because of the little evidence we have, it seems to be the case can be made that, yes, the Germans were working with ETs before World War II. Maybe now the U.S. military-industrial complex is working with a similar race with a similar agenda, but do we hear about other major governments like Russia or China working with their own ET races?
We don't hear about it.
We speculate about it. I guess some researchers have thought that, but it seems like such a big secret to keep.
Absolutely. And everybody's got to come clean. But the United States, I think, has been the principal reason that there has been secrecy in this area. Certainly, they have influenced most Western countries to maintain silence. Although I heard recently that when Winston Churchill became aware that he insisted on a 50-year ban of secrecy, but that 50 years is up now, so there's no reason why that would still apply. And it seems to me that they've all got to come clean. What we're really talking about is a world paradigm shift. We're so used to having one empire after another. And, whether it was the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, or an American empire, empires are out of date.
Right.
You can't impose that kind of power over other people on a wide scale anymore without getting into the kind of military conflict that threatens the future of the human species. And so at long last, we're face to face with the fact that we have to change our whole method of doing things, our whole modus operandi, and start collaborating and cooperating for a better world rather than trying to dominate, because domination is ultimately going to lead to conflict, which could lead to anything, including annihilation. And it's just about that simple.
And since you were in the Canadian cabinet, I'm curious just how much briefing you think a new president or prime minister gets about the alien presidents, or has this ET partnership now gone dark beyond the level of the presidency?
I think the answer is they got very, very little. The people in the cabal, none of whom are politicians in the active sense. They're politicians in the true sense of making things happen and so on, but they're not elected. They're not accountable. And consequently, they don't trust politicians to keep their mouths shut.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons, I guess, that so little information is passed on to even the commander-in-chief. I've seen one alleged briefing. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I've also heard of other briefings where the president has been given sort of a rough overview of what has been going on with appropriate information of a sort of macro kind, but very little detail and very little detail of what the Black Ops have been doing. We have a Canadian who is an expert in this, Grant Cameron from I think it's Calgary, and he's written a book on what presidents knew. And it makes quite a difference, I guess, between whether you're a Republican president or a Democratic president, how much information you're given. But George Bush Sr., I guess, because of his association with the CIA, would have been the most knowledgeable. Most of them just given a sort of peremptory idea of what's going on. And as far as Canada's concerned, I don't know if the Prime Minister would be given any information at all or not.
Huh.
It's hard to say. If so, it would be very sparse. And I know from my own experience as head of the Department of National Defense for 6 years that I got sighting reports, but no meat. No one ever said, well, we've direct contact with 2 species or something like this, which I now know is probably the case. But that information was never handed on to me as a politician. And it's partly because we don't have enough information to know what questions we should be asking. So I have some sympathy for the politicians, but at the same time, there is so much information in the public domain. All of the information in my book, about 95% of which would be news to the average reader, is in the public domain. It's not from secret documents. It's all out there. It just needs somebody to go and do a little digging. And that, of course, is the reason that we're so concerned about the controlled press, because they're the ones that should be doing the digging on behalf of the people, and instead they're doing the covering up on behalf of the cartel that controls them.
Well said, man. I totally agree. They're all about nonsense tabloid news and avoiding any real truth-seeking now in the mainstream media. And as far as disclosure is concerned, for so long, the UFO community would answer the question of why there's such a cover-up by saying that the governments of the world didn't want to cause a panic. And I always thought that was a phoned-in answer that didn't really make a lot of sense, because with all the death and destruction the cabal creates, I doubt they really care about the mental state of their citizens. I think it's more about knowledge is power, and there's no reason to empower people with things they aren't rioting over, which gets into the exotic energies that you mentioned earlier and also wrote quite a bit about, these empowering free energy devices. Some researchers claim we already have them, but it's tough to know if they're just guessing or being hopeful. And this is one of the reasons I have a guest like yourself on, who can be taken a little more seriously than some of the heavy speculators. And I know you're going to give it to us straight, so I got to know, man, have you had information in this realm disclosed to you in a more reliable way? Can you confirm for us in any way that these exotic free energy technologies could really be rolled out? Do we know for sure they're being suppressed?
That's a difficult question to answer. I have talked to quite a few people who have personal information, developments that have been trashed by someone, whether it's the FBI or by whom I don't know, who claim that they have seen workable models, that they have known people who are ready to go into production, and the next thing you know, they've committed suicide or their lab has been wrecked. And there's no doubt about, as far as the existence of free energy, as far as I'm concerned. And there's one example in the literature of the ET phenomena, and that is goes back to the alleged exchange of U.S. astronauts, going back to President Kennedy's day, and the trip to Serpo. And allegedly, I think it was 12 or 13 U.S. astronauts, 12 perhaps, went on an exchange visit. There was why, I don't know, just one ET kept here. And the reports, which are now available on the internet, and one has to judge their authenticity, but I think most of us have come to the conclusion that they are authentic. One of the early reports was that when they got there, they had little boxes, little square boxes of energy, and all they had to do was just plug into them. And this was, years ago. And this corresponds with what has been written elsewhere. Dr. Michael Wolff, who had a very, very high classification in the U.S., in a radio interview years ago, I don't know, about 15 years ago, something like that, said that the United States, allegedly with the assistance or cooperation of the ETs, had developed both cold fusion and zero-point energy, which is just what I was talking about a minute ago. And that this was, this was back in the 60s, I think, something like that, a long time ago. but it is being withheld because it does various things. First of all, it gives people independence. If you had one of these little boxes in your basement providing all the power for your house, you don't have to worry about ice storms and power lines going down. And you don't have to worry about paying a hydro bill electricity bill every month or whatever it is. So it gives people power, individual power, which is the antithesis, of course, of the idea of centralized power. And so I think there are some people that think, well, hey, we don't want these people in a position where they can more or less thumb their noses at us. Well, then the other thing, of course, is the cashing in of the oil chips. I'm personally positive that there are many secret patents on these subjects, and that all of the technology exists to save the world from overheating. And in my book, I recommend that we change the power source in every car, truck, tractor, airplane, ship, and home in 7 years. And I know that people sort of look at me when I say that, but I say that is, first of all, about the timetable that I believe is realistic. When I wrote my second last book called Light at the End of the Tunnel, the survival plan for the human species, which is still quite popular actually, I said we had 10 years, but that was written 3 or 4 years ago. And now I'm saying we have 7 years to ensure that the planet doesn't overheat. It is possible to do it. And the way would be exactly the opposite of what we did in World War II, which I remember very well. We took all of the automobile factories and the stove factories and refrigerator factories and converted them all to munitions. And by doing that massive effort, we produced the armaments and so on that were necessary to win the war. Well, now we should do just the opposite. If we're going to go to the kind of world we must go to, we don't need the armaments, but we need the clean energy. And so one of the recommendations I'm making is that the president use a presidential order to put the clean energy patents in the public domain. And incidentally, I think it's something that if there are any royalties at all, that they should be very, very small so that they can be used by people all over the world. It would be a tremendous opportunity. First of all, it would create billions of jobs, and it would revolutionize the distribution of income to a considerable extent. It would make it easier for people who are on the out now to have a fair, decent chance at things. So it could be done if we just said, okay, the world is going to change, and for the next 7 years, we're going to convert all these plants, or most of them anyway, to providing clean energy boxes that fit neatly into your house or your car or your truck or tractor or ship or whatever. And the opposition is largely from the cabal, both from the oil cartel, which has been spending hundreds of millions of dollars in disinformation. I make quite a few of these, do quite a few of these broadcasts in the States, and usually I get a few letters saying, Hellyer, agreed with everything you said except this business of global warming, and that's just a ruse. Well, it's not, because the science is absolutely clear. The temperatures are going up, and either we're going to stop it or we're going to allow it to continue for another 20 or 30 or 40 years until it's too late. And then we really have got a problem, because if we think these crazy weather patterns that we're seeing today are the end, I guess you can say that they're just the beginning, and that we don't know what would happen, and it would have a disruption worldwide, which would mean mass migrations and all sorts of problems that we had best avoid.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I wouldn't ever deny that the climate is changing. I just tend to think the Earth is going to go through these cycles regardless of what humans do or how we feel about it. but we should minimize the impact we have regardless and do things as cleanly as we can for everybody's sake. There's no reason not to. And it would be great if people rose up and demanded it. But first, we got to convince people that these technologies even exist. It's a bit funny because throughout your lifetime, you've gone from dialing a crank on the wall to modern smartphones with GPS and internet in your pocket, from black and white tube TVs to amazing HD flat screens, and again, a smartphone with that screen in your pocket. But we have not seen the same advances in energy at all. We're still using oil and coal and AA batteries, and it seems to fit the agenda to me, because if the cabal wants to keep us in debt and under control, it's done through resources and energy, obviously. And your electric bill is something you can never really pay off. There's always going to be more due next month. Your batteries will always die. The light bulb will always burn out. And it's always going to get more expensive. But I wanted to hop back a bit because you mentioned Project Serpo, which is a really wild saga. And then, of course, everyone knows about Roswell. But then you have the story in the book about a fleet of 50 UFOs in formation that flew from Russia across Europe. And that's one that I don't hear talked about very often. It had some interesting details. Can you tell the people about that? What happened there?
No, this is, it's not talked about very often, but in the 1960s, there were 50 UFOs that came south across Europe from the direction of Russia. And the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in Europe, SACEUR we call him, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, was so concerned, I think they were almost ready to press the panic button, when all of a sudden, without warning, the 50 turned around in formation and flew back towards the North Pole. So they knew, and I'm sure you can imagine the relief, can't you? If you're just sitting there in charge of the atomic response and all that sort of thing, when you realized that it was not an attack from Russia, and that you could relax and get on with some other things. Well, the other things included launching a study, which they did. I think it took 3 years to complete, and it showed or proved conclusively that there had been at least 4 species visiting Earth for thousands of years. And this is sort of a foundation, I think, for people to comprehend, because there are references in the Bible, for example, which once you understand UFOs and flying machines and all of this sort of thing, and possibility of extraterrestrial visitors, make a lot more sense to you than they do before you understand those things.
Wow, yeah, the fact that 4 different types of non-human entities have been interacting with humans for thousands of years, I mean, that's a bombshell. And who knows where they're really from or how comfortable they are here on Earth, but I love that story you told, and I find it interesting that they broke towards the North Pole, because we have on all types of guests and explore a lot of strange ideas, but there's a lot of people thinking that these beings might have pretty serious footholds at the North and South Pole because we go there so little, maybe just because of the harsh environment, or maybe a little more by design. Some researchers have even talked about massive holes at the poles where they might even be coming from somewhere inside the Earth. Far out stuff, but those areas are of huge interest to me. Has anything else like this regarding either of the North or South Poles come up in your investigations at all?
Nothing on the North Pole. In my book, I refer to a German base that was built on the Antarctic. This was years ago during World War II, probably built before World War II started. And there were ships operating from there. And one of the questions I ask is, does that still exist? Is it still there? And if so, who's in charge? And bring us up to date.
Yeah, it would be amazing to get that information. And you mentioned 4 species perhaps. And of course, we hear all kinds of numbers, but the 4 species, I guess the ones I hear about most often would be the grays, tall whites, reptilians, and insectoids. Are those kind of the 4 that you hear about the most also?
There are many, many more now. The numbers are very high. They kept going up and up. I remember having dinner with Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo astronaut, who came to our place when he was in Toronto making an address, and he wanted to meet me, so we had dinner at our place, and it was rather a fun evening. And he was from Roswell. At one point, he said about the alleged crash at Roswell, and I said, "Oh, come on, Edgar. Why do you use the word alleged?" And of course, his face went red because he knew that he would just said something that was nonsense. And right after that, he said, "Well, how many species do you think there are?" Mm-hmm. Question to me. And I said, "Somewhere between 2 and 12. And he said, "Yes, that's what I think too." Well, that was, let's see, I think 8 years ago. Since then, the numbers have just been going up. And I have seen numbers I wouldn't even use on the air. Because I think if you go far enough out into the universe, the numbers become astronomical.
Right.
I saw a number a long time ago of 26 different species that had been identified. And then I saw a number that was greater than that. So there are a lot of them. And as Earthlings, I think we don't necessarily have the same agendas, which is the reason I'm very anxious to have full disclosure, so that we know who they are and as much about them as we have on record. Because most of the ufologists that I know think that they are, for the most part, benign. And there's a lot of talk about them wanting to help us and to do things for us. And certainly we could use their help in some areas other than the military. And those other areas, in my opinion, would be agriculture and medicine, for example, where they're, again, just a long way ahead of us. But yeah, there are many species, and most of them are benign. But allegedly, and this always comes up in the presidential briefing, they say that there's one that isn't, or may not be. Well, I've never said publicly who that one was, and one has to guess or look at the literature to see if you can figure it out. But I guess I'd like to see some kind of connection between the Earth and the benign groups who want to help us and work with us, and then sort of put that in perspective with the possibility that there are one or two that are working on projects that are not in our best interests.
Right. Paul, this has been super fascinating. We've been all over the map, covered a lot of angles. I really respect your decision to pursue these avenues and speak out both about the money mafia and alien disclosure, not something many people are willing to do. So thanks again for that and for talking to me today. Would you like to remind the people about some of your books and your website and where they can get the books and all that before we really wrap it up?
Okay, thank you. The two last books are first the Light at the End of the Tunnel, a survival plan for the human species. And if you're interested in doing two books, I would get that one and read it first. It has sort of an introduction to it has one chapter on the ET affair. Then the most important one is the latest one, The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis. It's more powerful, it's more up to date. It has two chapters related to the ET file, but it brings in more issues and ties them together more as one great big ball of wax. And also, both have an action plan, but the most recent book is slightly enhanced. It has more things that have to be done, and it spends a little more time on global warming and the urgency of getting away from just thinking that this is a problem that's going to go away if we don't pay attention to it, and so on. The books are available, I presume, through most bookstores. Certainly they're available from Amazon. My website is paulhedderweb.com, but there are other places, and probably some less expensive than that, because of the postage problems that apply to us ordinary mortals. So I urge people, I really hope, and I'm going to promote I'm hoping a lot of people will get the money mafia and then start writing to the president and to their senator and to their congressperson and saying, we want action and we want it now. And here's a list of things, and it's a long list. Well, it's a short list, really, but a list that includes getting rid of the Fed, abolishing the Bank for International Settlements, abolishing the International Monetary Fund, and so on. So it's quite a comprehensive approach to reform. But there are things that if we did, and if we then took the advice in the postscript and changed our hearts and minds to cooperation and love and concern for others rather than just concern for ourselves, and stopped worshiping technology and money, we could soon, I think, make quite a dent in the problems that exist in the world today, and maybe, with luck, reverse the course of history before it's too late and we disappear as a species, as has happened.
Well, good stuff, Paul. I so agree with you there, and I love Money Mafia. I think the action plan in it is spot on. I would love to see some movement on that. And this has been a fascinating talk, man. Thanks so much, Paul. We need more people out there like you, and take care of yourself out there. All right, sir?